Hello, everybody. It's so nice to have you join me this evening for one of my favorite topics, and it has to do with instrument reprocessing, specifically on how to get your Steri-Center up to spec and why it's important for your business. My name is Karen Dawn. I have the pleasure of presenting this webinar. As I said earlier, it's one of my favorite topics, so I'm super excited to be sharing this information with you. And I want to very quickly not only thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us, but also to thank Steri-Center for the very generous sponsorship of this particular presentation. I know that some of you guys have probably sat in on your fair share of training sessions that have to do with infection control and instrument reprocessing. And perhaps you're asking yourself, why am I sitting here listening to this all over again? What else am I going to get new out of this particular presentation? And some of you, perhaps your boss or your supervisor, they didn't necessarily volunteer you, but they voluntold you to be here, and bless you. Y'all let me know how you feel, and you wear your emotions on your sleeve, and maybe you're not too thrilled to be here, right? You're kind of questioning, what's in it for me if I've been through this? I get it. It's not the most glamorous topic in the world. I do hope, though, as an educator, if you bear with me for just 1 hour, that's all I'm asking for, that hopefully you'll walk away with at least one new bit of information. If you walk away with one new bit of information that you might be able to add to your existing program, safety program, and enhance your existing safety program, then as an educator, I feel like I've done my job. We do have several goals as part of this presentation. One of them is that you walk away happy, right? That you feel like this was worth your time. We also want you to walk away with an understanding of the different roles the various agencies play in a part in how we design and utilize the sterilization area. I also want you to become familiar with the proper Steri-Center design and the 4 important areas to include. So whether you are just starting out and you're considering how you're going to build your Steri-Center, or maybe you want to enhance your existing space, we're going to give you some really good resources that you can utilize. And those resources are going to include some automated systems that are going to help you with efficiency and compliance with this within this area. It's not enough just that you sit in and listen to this. I want us to be active participants. You know, I don't want safety training to ever be something that people don't look forward to. I don't want anybody to look at it as, you know, something mandatory that I just do and check out the box every year. I really want us to think about safety and infection control as it relates to the sterilization area as part of a culture of safety. So at the very end of this, I'm going to invite you to create an action item list, a plan, if you will, based on the information that you've gleaned from this presentation. And hopefully together, we will achieve what your desires are as far as streamlining, leaning up the processes and the systems and instrument processing, and ensuring a safe work area. There's a lot of different entities that kind of have a say in how we do instrument reprocessing. Certainly, you're familiar with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. They set forth recommendations. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration is under the umbrella of the Department of Labor. So as you can imagine, they're primarily concerned with employee safety. And the CDC recommendations can be adopted at a local level via your state dental board. So where I'm based out of in Columbus, Ohio, the Ohio State Dental Board does enforce elements of the CDC. You do want to check with your local dental board. And then, of course, OSHA, under their bloodborne pathogens and hazard communication standard, you'll find that they align very closely with the CDC recommendations as well. And whatever OSHA doesn't specifically address as it relates to employee safety that the CDC might cover, well, then OSHA has something called a general duty clause that they can fall back on, and they can utilize that when they're enforcing standards of safe practices within your business. We, of course, have the ADA. We have a lot of different acronyms. AMI, the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation. I want to point out very quickly of the entities on this board. AMI, ADA, CDC are not enforcement agencies. No one's going to show up in your practice and say, I'm here with the CDC, I'm here to investigate your practice, right? But certainly your state dental board and OSHA and the EPA certainly can. And very quickly, I want to mention the EPA governs the biohazardous and chemical waste that you generate within your practice. how we store that waste and what happens to that waste once it leaves your practice. They also regulate the disinfectants that we use. So I thought that was pretty interesting when I got into this industry. The Food and Drug Administration, as you can imagine, regulates both food and drug, but they also play a very important role in your Steri-Center in that they are the ones that clear and validate medical devices. They're the reason that we use a sterilization pouch or a sterilization wrap as opposed to brown paper bags. They're the reason why we use an FDA-cleared sterilizer and not a toaster oven to sterilize our instruments. And yet, earlier this year, I saw that in a medical practice. So nothing surprises me anymore. I'm going to try and share with you guys some really interesting or fun stories that I've come across during my 24 years, almost 25 years of doing this training. So I started when I was about 4 or 5 years old, right? Wink, wink, just kidding. All right. But who else watches what we do? If you answered the patient, you would be correct. And we have to consider that patient perception is reality. If you performed proper hand hygiene, but they didn't see you do it, in their opinion, did it happen? Same thing with the instruments. All they know is that when they show up at the appointment, these instruments show up, but they don't know what happens behind the scenes as far as how we reprocess those instruments. How many times have one of you been asked by a patient, do you throw away all your instruments between appointments? I think it happens more often than we realize. And it's because they kind of get it, but they kind of don't, right? And I think as human beings, we're really good about filling in the blanks of a story when we don't know the whole story. And what does the shoe have to do with what I'm saying? Well, I would love it if you use the Q&A box right now and tell me, what color is this shoe? What two primary colors do you see in this shoe? And typically, you're going to see either a pink and white shoe or you're seeing gray and teal. Yes, yes. Okay, answers are coming in. And Kelly says pink and white. Miriam says blue and gray or teal and gray. Missy says gray and teal. And Priscilla says gray and teal. So we have a variety of responses. How is it that we're possibly all looking at the same picture but seeing something different? It has nothing to do with your computer monitors. I have done this presentation in front of audiences of 700 all looking at the same slide in the same room, and they still see different color shoes too. They could be sitting right next to somebody who sees something different. I always ask them, who's wrong? And they're all pointing at each other, right? But it's a trick question, right? We're all right. Our perception is our reality, and we have to consider that when it comes to the patient. And I invite you to invite the patient into the discussion of safety within the practice, because what's at stake? If our patients don't know what we're doing behind the scenes, and we don't have a properly designed Steri-Center, and we don't have the proper equipment and the number of instruments, a proper number of instruments, what's at stake if there's a breach, right? There's potential for injury to the patient, injury to our team members, potential fines also. If you think about willful neglect fine under OSHA, well, currently as of 2019 numbers, that's a potential of $139,000 for purposeful disregard. And if the employer acts with plain and indifference to the employee's safety. And it may sound like it never happened, it can never happen to you, but I have seen large fines associated with dental practices. And then also, if a patient comes in and they have a complaint, they can certainly go to your local dental board, and now you're facing potential license suspension. If they don't go that far, well, you know, by golly, Yelp, Google reviews, and word of mouth. They're happy to tell other people about their negative experiences if they perceive something to be a negative experience related to safety and infection control. There's lawsuits, and there's also your reputation as well. Negative online reviews. A recent estimate put that one negative online review can equate to potentially 30 lost patients. Now, if you consider that maybe just those patients would only ever come in for a cleaning, over the course of 20 years, one patient might have spent about $8,000, right? When you multiply that by 30, now you're looking at almost $250,000 in potential lost revenue from that negative online review. And certainly we hear about, there's no shortage of articles related to breaches in instrument reprocessing, infection control breaches related to instrument reprocessing. This was just a literature review or news review of within the last several months. So one of them popped up in my news feed just yesterday. I want to point out that in one of these cases in Virginia, a dental office, due diligence, they reported this breach to their patients, offered to test everybody for hepatitis B, C, and HIV. And to date, knock on wood, no one has reported contracting anything, but the practice is still being sued. And I want you to think about why. Why would they continue to be sued even though, phew, thank goodness, we haven't contracted anything? Well, attorneys' two favorite words, right? Pain and suffering, and also emotional distress, right? I'm not an attorney. I don't claim to be one. I did marry into a family of attorneys, and I stayed at a Holiday Inn Express once. So I kind of look at the legalities of how this impacts the practice, coming from a business standpoint. So how do we protect ourselves then? Well, there's obviously education, but when I ask people, how do you protect yourself from hazards within the sterilization area, the number one response I get is, well, I wear my mask and I wear my gloves and I have a jacket and maybe I might wear eyewear if it's warranted. But if you look at NIOSH's hierarchy of controls, which is this upside down triangle, and NIOSH is the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, they say that PPE, while effective, should be your last line of defense. We really need to identify the hazards that exist in the workplace and in your sterilization area, replace those hazards, and if we can't substitute those hazards, then we're going to implement engineering controls, administrative/work practice controls that's going to protect our employees, and then finally, we rely on PPE. So when I talk about engineering controls, I just want to go over the definition very quickly because this is part of your exposure control plan, and we'll do a deeper dive on that as we go through this presentation. And by no means is this a comprehensive presentation on instrument reprocessing. It is really kind of an extreme focus of sliver on just this one topic, right? So engineering controls, these are devices or equipment controls that eliminate, isolate, or remove the risk of exposure to blood or body fluids. They might be devices used to reduce the likelihood of a sharps exposure. It's something physical, something tangible, something that I can use, purchase, implement in my practice that makes things safer. So for example, using an instrument cassette during patient treatment as well as during instrument reprocessing is going to minimize direct contact with a contaminated sharp. So obviously right there, that's much safer. I think you'll all agree that a solid, rigid, red biohazard labeled sharps container is a much safer method of disposing of contaminated sharps than, for example, a plastic grocery bag. And yet I have seen that in dental offices previously as well. When I describe work practice controls, remember that's one of the slivers on the hierarchy. When I talk about work practice controls, this is behavior-based, right? It's task-oriented. It's knowing that if I'm not going to use a device, an engineering control to help me recap needles, then I'm going to practice one-handed recapping of needles, or scoop technique. I'm going to know that I'm going to place my contaminated sharps immediately in a sharps container. So when I'm coaching practices, I just did a virtual consult for an office out of state where we talked about this. I want them to have sharps containers in each operatory because technically you should be disposing of contaminated disposable sharps at the source point of generation. It's knowing that we're not going to reach by hand into any container with contaminated sharps. Now, this picture that you see here is a friend of mine, and it's the dental assistant at her practice. And this picture is staged, but I wanted to recreate it because the office that I was actually walking through wouldn't let me take the picture. And you'll see that there's a lot of violations in this photo. But one of the things that she's doing is she's reaching by hand into a container with contaminated sharps. Now, I will tell you, I hear from people all the time, but I wear exam gloves when I do that. Well, that's not enough. There's a reason why there's a basket in our ultrasonic, right? So ideally, we would be using that to lift and lower the instruments rather than reaching by hand into there. I visited a dental office, and I was told the story of one of the team members had lost the diamond on their ring setting in the sharps container. What do you think they did? Well, if you answered they went in after it, you would be correct. After dumping it all over the bracket table and sifting through it, they then went into the sharps container and got stuck not once, but twice, and it was treated as an unknown exposure, and several thousands of dollars later in testing and follow-up consults. Thank goodness this person didn't contract anything, but that would have been an OSHA violation, right? So it's not enough that we have these systems in place. We also have to, there's an educational component to it as well. We have to have designated areas for biohazardous processes, and then designated areas for food and beverages as well. Then we rely on personal protective equipment, and it's provided to us at no charge by our employer. I did work with an office once who shared that a previous dentist rationed out their PPE. So every day they got 2 Ziploc baggies. One of them had masks in it and gloves, and the other one had disinfecting wipes. And that's all they had to get them through the day, and it wasn't enough. And if they requested more, well, they got charged for it. So OSHA says that we must offer PPE at no charge to our employees. The PPE must be removed before leaving the patient or the treatment area. The employer must determine the risk by performing a risk assessment to determine what PPE is needed to protect against that potential hazard. Overseeing your entire program is our infection control coordinator. You might call them your safety officer. That's the title I give them, because I think infection control is one aspect of safety within the practice. You can call them your OSHA queen, whatever you want to call them. The next time you see them, I hope that you will thank them for everything that they do to ensure that we're in compliance. Because in addition to their regular roles and responsibilities, they're reviewing policies, they're creating standard operating procedures, they're identifying gaps in outdated information, they are ensuring that the practice meets its required annual safety training and initial safety training for new employees, they're monitoring compliance through observations, checklists, and other methods, they maintain the exposure control plan, and they ensure a safe work environment in tandem with the practice owner. Right? So I want to focus real quickly on exposure control plan. What is an exposure control plan? Well, your exposure control plan details specifically all the ways that we protect our employees and prevent them from being exposed to hazardous risks and hazards and bloodborne pathogen hazards in the workplace too. So at this time, I would like to poll you and ask you, if you haven't already answered, A, B, C, or D, which one of these actually fit what's going on in your practice. Okay, so it looks like fabulous. It sounds like majority of you have an exposure control plan. You know what it is. It is site specific. You didn't just buy an OSHA manual and stick it or fill out the blanks and then stick it on a shelf for the next year, right? Everyone is trained on the elements to proficiency, right? And that it is updated annually. I appreciate your honesty, by the way. We also have people that said, we have one. That's about it. We don't know if we've done anything with it, right? A little under a quarter of you said that we don't know if we have one or we've never heard of it. So definitely there's an opportunity there to enhance your compliance program. And then this is kind of alarming, about a little over 10% of us do not even have one, right? So we need to make sure that we have an exposure control plan, because it is site specific. It is a requirement that we have it, and it covers the elements of safety in all areas of the practice, including our Steri-Center. The fact that a lot of you answered you didn't have one that was site-specific isn't surprising to me. NIOSH and the Organization for Safety, Asepsis, and Procedure did a survey. And by the way, if you're not a member of OSAP, osap.org, I highly recommend it. Some fabulous resources available from them, and some wonderful annual conferences chock full of information. But they discovered that a lot of people did not have a written site-specific ECP, including 4% who didn't know whether or not they had one. 50% without an ECP had no plans to implement one within the next year, even though this was a mandatory requirement. 20% with a plan had not implemented all of the elements, and the main reasons were they were not aware it was needed. They didn't understand, they weren't given the tools to understand how to be successful and understand why it was required, so they lacked the expertise. Lack of time. I think we're pulled in a million different directions. Like I said, our infection control coordinators many times are full-time dental assistants, full-time practice managers, or hygienists, or even the doctors. And so they're given very little time to focus on safety. And that 24% of them with a plan had not reviewed it within the past year. So it's very important that not only do we have it, that we train upon the elements of it, because as you're going to see how it ties directly into the sterilization area. We need to train on bloodborne pathogens and safety upon hire annually when there's been new processes. And I encourage all of my practices that I coach and when I speak at events, that it really should be woven into the fabric of your regular meetings. So if you're having morning huddles or formal monthly meetings, I think we can absolutely carve out what if we carved out 3 to 5 minutes to talk about safety, a safety topic of your choice, right? And you're going to get a lot of wonderful opportunities from this presentation alone as far as safety topics that you can discuss at your next meeting. So regular meetings helps to enhance and create a culture of safety. And you have to consider that training is an investment. AmTrust Financial Services, they do workers' compensation insurance, and they compiled a report that quantifies the return on investment of safety. So again, we don't want to look at safety as a mandatory event, that safety training is mandatory, just something that we do. We want you to understand why it's so important, how it benefits the practice. Companies that have a safety program can reduce their expenses related to injuries and illnesses by 40%. And that every dollar we spend on safety can save at least $3 down the road on expenses related to work or injury. We find that new and inexperienced employees are more likely to be hurt, with 40% of those injured having been on the job less than a year. And that injuries at work cost businesses more than $161 billion per year across the spectrum. So we can see easily that if we were looking at it from this financial standpoint, which, I mean, I should hope that that's not the only motivation you have, right? But if we look at it from a financial standpoint, it's definitely worth your time. It's definitely worth the investment. So how are we going to apply this to instrument reprocessing? And these pictures, I get asked this all the time, are these actual pictures? Is what I need to be wearing when I'm in sterilization? And the answer to that question is yes. If you're anticipating spatter or spray, if you're reprocessing instruments, so the way to think about it is if you're going to be chairside, we wear the appropriate PPE if we're anticipating spatter and spray, right? Or if we're coming in contact with blood, saliva, or other potentially infectious materials. We've got our long sleeve jackets on. We've got our eyewear or loops or full length face shield on. We've got masks on. We've got gloves on, right? Well, if you're debriding instruments, if you're anticipating spatter and spray from rinsing instruments, cleaning instruments, then absolutely we anticipate that we expect that you're going to have the right type of personal protective equipment. It doesn't matter where you are in the practice. Remember, the PPE has to match the potential hazard and protect you from the potential hazard. So let's talk about what needs to be sterilized versus what can be disinfected. You've probably seen this slide numerous times in a lot of infection control presentations. For those of you who are not familiar with this or just want a refresher, I felt that this was important enough to include. Now, the Spalding classification breaks this down for us, and while it's not an ideal system, it has served us well for many, 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 many years, right? So what can be disinfected? Well, anything classified as a non-critical item, an item that doesn't ordinarily touch the patient or touches only intact skin, well, that can be cleaned by disinfection. We expect everything else to be able to withstand sterilization or be single-use disposable item. And ideally, heat sterilization, right? And always following the manufacturer's IFU or instructions for use. So we want to make sure we're following the IFU. So non-critical items include radiograph heads and cones, blood pressure cuffs, face bows, pulse ox, everything else we expect to be single-use disposable or heat tolerant, or at a minimum being able to withstand high-level disinfection if the IFU specifically states that. Ideally, we would want those items sterilized. Just a quick note on disinfection. This is just based on my own personal experience, right, on disinfection. The good folks at SciCan, too, noticed the same thing, that we are using disinfectants without wearing gloves. This is a common observation for me. If you think about the type of disinfectant we must use in a healthcare setting, you do not want to use those without personal protective equipment on, definitely not without gloves. So a lot of times people think, oh, the type of disinfectant I use in my office is like the stuff that I use at home or at the grocery store when I'm wiping down the handle of the shopping cart, and that's not the same. An EPA registered hospital grade tuberculocidal disinfectant is classified as a pesticide. right? So we need to adhere to the requirements when it comes to managing pesticide. Otherwise, it's the same thing as spraying weed killer directly onto your skin. And I don't think anybody wants to do that. I have heard a dental assistant tell me that they had a spatter exposure on their face. I don't know how it happened and why they weren't wearing PPE, but they had an exposure incident, and they said that they used to take a disinfecting wipe and wipe their face directly whenever that happened. I did this presentation for a room full of nurses, and I heard one nurse tell me that if she ever had a breakout or a pimple, she would take a disinfecting wipe and dab at it, and she said the very next day it would be gone. Well, I can see why that would be, because it's it's virucidal and bactericidal, but it's definitely not, it's an off-label use of the product, and that's highly discouraged, right? Label transferred chemicals, anything that we have in its original container transferred to a secondary container, we want to make sure that we transfer chemicals. That we label the chemicals, that's been transferred. Never mix chemicals, right? You may have a reaction. You may cause a buildup to occur on the surface. There's a lot of reasons why we don't want to do that. I mentioned earlier it needs to be an EPA registered product with a tuberculocidal claim. I still use the terminology spray wipe, discard wipe, just to kind of demonstrate that if the label specifically says the surface needs to be cleaned, if a contaminated surface needs to be cleaned before it is to be disinfected, well, then that's a two-step product. So read the label and see if it's a two-step product, or if it says it's a single step, one step cleaner / disinfectant, then you don't need to pre-clean that surface. Keep that container lid closed. I don't know if it drives you crazy as much as it drives me crazy when I reach for a disinfecting wipe and the lid has been open and it's all dried up, right? You're going through a lot more products. No in-house wipes. I still see people who take kind of the leftover, what I call the leftover disinfectant juice, pour it into a Tupperware container, put some 4x4 gauze in there, and they've created their own disinfecting wipes. Keep the surface wet for the contact time. You'd be surprised. I can ask 10 people in your office, what is the contact time for the product you use? And I'll get 10 different responses. So very important that we all know the contact time. And you always want to hear the longest contact time on the product label so that you inactivate all of the pathogens indicated for that product. Okay. So as we move and apply these principles to your Steri-Center, the question earlier, or the question we're asking in this slide, is your Steri-Center up to spec? And the whole presentation is about getting your Steri-Center up to spec. And spec is an acronym for how do we ensure safe processes? Safety for our patients, safety for our team members. How do we ensure predictable results and outcomes? Is it efficient? Is it streamlined, right? Have we applied some of the basic concepts of a Lean Sigma within this area to reduce labor and overhead and ensure safety? And are we compliant? Are we compliant with state and federal and maybe even country regulations when it comes to instrument reprocessing? The first step is to define the space. How is this space defined? As part of your exposure control plan, it specifically asks you under the housekeeping section, what are your clinical spaces? What are your non-clinical spaces? How do you clean and disinfect clinical contact surfaces versus housekeeping surfaces, right? So this picture was shared with me, and I don't know if you can see it, but right around the corner of the ultrasonic, you see the tip of a toothbrush, and one could easily assume that soft bristled toothbrush is used for cleaning instruments. But then you see the mirror, and you see the mouthwash, and you see the coffee maker, and well, maybe it's not so obvious it's used for instruments. That might be somebody's toothbrush, right? So you have to have clearly defined spaces in the practice. There are 4 zones of your sterilization center. Now that we've classified the Steri-Center as a clinical space, there are 4 zones that you're going to move through. And you're going to move through it in one direction, right, without ping-ponging back and forth. You're going to move from dirty to clean. You've heard that phrase before. From the highest amount of contamination to the least amount of contamination. And those 4 zones begin with receiving, cleaning, and decontamination, preparation and packaging, sterilization, and finally storage. And we want these spaces divided at least physically, and if not physically, spatially. When I first started off in dentistry, we did instrument processing in a room the size of a closet. So in that case, if you have a small workspace, signages, might be helpful, but it's really helpful only for the team member, because gosh, they would work great if the germs and the bugs could read, right? but unfortunately that's not the case. So we want to make sure that we have a system in place or design in place that facilitates safety in the Steri-Center. Okay. A lot of people think instrument processing begins the moment those instruments enter our Steri-Center. It actually begins chairside, right at the end of the appointment. You can have loose instruments sitting on a tray. You may have instruments as cassettes as part of your instrument management system. In either case, you want to make sure that those are contained properly. And blending CDC and OSHA, right? That means that we've got to have a solid, rigid container, transport container with the lid read or labeled as biohazard. In this case, we have one that's read and labeled as biohazard. You also have to have appropriate PPE. In some instances, it's going to require a heavy-duty, puncture-resistant, chemical-resistant utility glove, chairside, and certainly when you're cleaning instruments. That's not an if, that is a must, right, in instrument reprocessing, making sure we have the proper PPE, and it includes those utility gloves. With receiving, cleaning, and decontamination, there's a couple ways that we can clean our instruments. We can clean it manually, but I think we've all evolved from just strictly manually cleaning. We now have automated systems that are much more efficient, much safer for us. I like ultrasonics. It's good to have an ultrasonic because that is an old automated system, but I'm a big fan of instrument washers, and I'll share with you why in just a little bit. I also like automatic handpiece lubricators and cleaners versus manually doing that. So with automated cleaning systems, how is it safe? So we're going to answer the question of spec when it comes to this area. Well, with automated systems, it reduces the handling of contaminated sharps and direct exposure, in many cases, to contaminated sharps. It reduces the contact time or the amount of steps required to clean the instruments, and that therefore fewer steps where you're exposed to contaminants. It provides consistent cleaning performance, right? Some ultrasonics and instrument washers have remote troubleshooting, so you'll get an email the moment there's a problem with either one of them. It's efficient because it reduces manual labor, so it frees up the time for our team members to focus on other things, right? It's just like that commercial some time ago when it comes to the instrument washer. You can put your cassettes in there and you just set it and forget it, right? You can go and do something else for the next 30, 40 minutes. And it's compliant because it meets the CDC instrument reprocessing guidelines, and it meets OSHA's recommendations to minimize contact with reusable sharps. With our handpiece oiler, it's the same thing. It's safe because it minimizes the amount of aerosols and chemicals that you might be exposed to. It's predictable because there's consistent purge time, consistent amount of cleaner and lubricant. It's efficient in that it reduces manual labor, right? It's compliant, again, with CDC and OSHA. This is a chart from our friends over at SciCan. They loaned this slide to me. I'm so grateful for them. And in it, it shows the steps of instrument processing, right? So this is nothing new. You can find this in the OSAP workbook and in CDC guidelines. And they talk about steps moving through the instrument processing pathway. And it starts with the instruments being used on the patient, right? So I said instrument processing begins at the end of that appointment. Then we transport those instruments. There's an optional pre-cleaning or holding. If those instruments have to sit for a while, you want to make sure you have an instrument pre-soak or an enzymatic that's labeled for that specific purpose. Then you might rinse that off, then pop it in ultrasonic to clean it, rinse it again. I don't like the terminology pat dry or air dry. Really, we should air dry. OSHA says that in the absence of PPE, would we still do that? And the answer would be, if I had no PPE on, I definitely wouldn't want to pat dry my instruments. So air drying is a lot safer. Then we package it, sterilize it, store it, and then it's used on the patient again, and round and round and round we go. All of these red arrows are opportunities for exposure, right? Direct exposure to a contaminated item. That blue arrow shows that had you been using an automated system like an instrument washer, well, you go straight from transport to cleaning and drying. I love that the instrument washers also dry our instruments. So all we have to do is take it out, wrap it, and pop it into the sterilizer. How convenient is that? In preparation and packaging, we need to have internal and external indicators. So you see on the peel view pouch, we've got the little arrow that changes colors on the inside of that seal as well as the one on the outside. They can be single parameter or multi-parameter. And with cassettes, you need to have the autoclave tip on the outside, and you want to have an indicator on the inside too. A common observation I get in dental offices is that we have those instrument cassettes, we have the autoclave tape, but we don't have anything on the inside. We don't have a chemical indicator on the inside. So ideally, an indicator, I'd like to see integrators on the inside of the cassettes, but ideally at a minimum, a chemical indicator strip. Now, these are process verification, meaning it doesn't mean that it's sterile, right? It just tells us that it went through the sterilizer when it's exposed to at least one parameter for sterilization, and usually that's temperature or combination of factors. When I travel, I like to get my nails done if I'm speaking in front of a large group, right? They're spending half a day with me, sometimes a full day with me. I want to make sure that I'm looking on point, and that includes my nails. And I always look for a nail salon that sterilizes their nail trimmers and their cuticle pushers, right, and all the instruments that they're using on my nails. And I found a salon near the hotel I was staying at once that said our instruments are safe, and it showed a picture of a sterilizer on their front page, and I thought, oh, that's fabulous. So I walked into the nail salon. I picked up one of the sterilization pouches. I said, I am in infection prevention. I am super excited that you sterilize your instruments. Can you show me where this happens? And the gal looked at me like a deer in headlights, right? And she said, you want to see what? I said, I would like to see where your instruments are being cleaned and packaged and sterilized. And so she took me into the back room, and I'm expecting to see a small tabletop sterilizer and an ultrasonic. And instead, I see a stack of sterilization pouches and an iron, because that single parameter sterilization pouch was changing colors when exposed to a particular temperature in the presence of steam, right? And so somewhere along the line, someone told her that these pouches meant that the instruments were safe, and she wanted her clients to know that the instruments were safe, so that's what she was doing. The other thing about preparation and packaging that I see a common observation is that we're not labeling our packages, right? And we want to make sure that when we're labeling our packages, at a minimum, we want to put the date that it was sterilized, as well as which sterilizer we use. So we have multiple sterilizers. We're going to number them A, B, or C, or 1, 2, or 3, whatever the case may be, and then which cycle we are on for that day. So preparation and packaging, how do we ensure safety? Well, we're not handling loose instruments, right, that might poke us. It's predictable in that when it's exposed to at least one parameter for sterilization, at least one, it's going to change colors. It's efficient as far as helping us to store items properly, and it's certainly in compliance with CDC and OSHA as well. Other ways that you can label your packaging, I love this, is the sterilization marker, and you can use this to mark your packages before it goes in the sterilizer. I do see offices that'll use Sharpie markers, and sometimes they'll tell me, oh, but it's non-toxic, and I have to advise them against it. As one sterilizer manufacturer told me, that they just don't know long-term what that constant exposure to that vaporized ink in the sterilizer, what that might do to the actual sterilizer, and that it might void your warranty on that sterilizer, right? I mentioned earlier that I'm a big fan of integrators. So what is an integrator? An integrator is also a type of chemical indicator. It's a highest level of chemical indicator, as a matter of fact. And here's where the FDA comes in again. The FDA has approved an integrator as being equal in performance to a spore strip test. Now, it's very important for me to share with you, this does not mean it replaces the requirement for you to use a spore strip test. If your state has weekly requirements at a minimum, right? Weekly requirements at a minimum to run a spore strip test, you're not just going to run an integrator and call it a day. This is designed to be used in tangent with your spore strip test. So the office I work with, I tell them to run an integrator with that spore strip test. It's immediate read strip. If that integrator fails, don't bother to mail that spore strip test, because that's most likely going to fail as well. So it tells us before we get those results back whether or not there's a problem with our sterilizer. It's recommended to be used with each steam cycle to protect against the release of non-sterile items. So when I was the clinic health and safety director at the Ohio State University College of Dentistry, we implemented the use of integrators with every single packet, right? But at a minimum, you want to use it in every cycle. And what this did was this allowed us to ensure that any instruments that we released, at least they were exposed to all the conditions for sterilization within that sterilizer. With sterilization, we want to make sure we clean and sterilize all intraoral reusable items. We never want to wrap anything or run anything through a sterilizer unwrapped. Rapid, or once upon a time it was called flash sterilization, it's now known as immediate use steam sterilization, is the exception, not the norm. When an office tells me they're running a bunch of hand pieces unwrapped, it tells me we don't have enough hand pieces for that practice. Those packages must be dry when they come out of the sterilizer, right? Every single manufacturer, sterilizer manufacturer that I've talked to said that if the instruments are coming out wet, there's a problem with the process, right? It's either a problem with the sterilizer, or most likely it's operator error. We've overloaded the sterilizer, or we have too many instruments per pouch, or we didn't let it go through the dry cycle is the most common reason I hear. Test your sterilizers weekly and with implantable devices. So how do sterilizers meet the spec? An appropriate sterilizer will keep you safe, right? I like the newer generation of sterilizers that don't even open the door until it's gone through the dry cycle, right? So you're not even exposed to any of that hot steam. The newer sterilizers have automatic drain and automatic refill options as well. It's predictable in that it has information that it can send you via email as to whether or not each cycle met all the parameters for sterilization. It also can email you about troubleshooting. It may have printouts that also let you know that, so you have predictable outcomes. It's efficient. The larger sterilizers I really like because it has a larger capacity. I can put more packages in there. I can put more cassettes in there. Again, following the manufacturer's IFU for proper loading, and it's compliant with CDC instrument reprocessing guidelines, right? We also want to follow the IFU, still very, very important. You're going to hear me say this a lot. It's not a bad word. If you're now just joining us, it stands for instructions for use. And every instrument manufacturer should have instructions for use that you should be able to download or have access to so that you know the proper way to reprocess those instruments. You want to follow the manufacturer's instructions because, for example, it might say, I have a hinged instrument. You want to process it, those hinged instruments open, right? It might say disassemble those instruments if required. Make sure that the packaging is compatible with the method of heat sterilization being used. I found an interesting IFU in one of my practices recently that said, don't use alcohol-based disinfectants for wiping down your hand pieces. And when I started off in dentistry, as I said, over 20 years ago, well, that was the norm. That's what we did. We wiped it down with the disinfectant, and then we would sterilize it. And this one said specifically, if you're going to wipe it down with the disinfectant, it has to be a particular type of chemical, right? Don't overload your sterilizers. Oh my gosh, this is the number one reason for your sterilizer to fail, right? It's operator error, and many times it's that we've overloaded it. I give this lady an A for creativity in that she ran this cycle by removing the trays and then shoved a bunch of stuff in there, right? With the thought that you're going to be able to process more instruments. So I get it. I get where she was going with this, but we know that that is not acceptable. So what is the proper way to load your sterilizer? In a nutshell, lighter items on top, heavier items like cassettes on the bottom. And again, following your manufacturer's IFU for loading. Now, so a common question I get is paper side up or paper side down? I would love to hear your responses in the Q&A box. Is it paper side up or paper side down for your particular sterilizer? Okay, and this is where it's kind of a trick response, right? Because ideally it's actually on its side, but your manufacturer as IFU for your sterilizer may say paper side up or paper side down. And I will tell you that you wanted to follow the manufacturer's IFU, but majority of the steam sterilizers, the IFUs that I have read, have said they want you to load your instruments, your PeelView pouches, paper side down in the sterilizer. But I'm not going to tell you which one wants them up and which ones want them down, because I want you to refer to the IFU for your particular sterilizer. I also want to take a moment to address some common questions I get, some frequently asked questions related to sterilization, and that is burrs and endo files as single-use items. So I don't want you to hear misleading information from anybody. This is straight from the CDC website, and they specifically say that some devices, such as burrs and endo files, it's practical to consider them single use because the way they're constructed makes them hard to clean. And I totally agree with that. If you've ever tried to clean a diamond burr, it's like cleaning sandpaper. And the FDA considers, get this, the FDA, here they are again, considers all diamond coated burrs and scalers single use unless the manufacturers have submitted a 510K for reprocessing. And I will tell you, as of today's presentation, they don't have any on file. So that tells us that we should be treating diamond-coated burrs and scalar tips as single-use currently. So again, I'm going to tell you to always refer to the manufacturer's IFU. If there are no validated reprocessing instructions, it really should be considered a single-use disposable item. What about items connected to air and water lines like handpieces and handpiece motors? Once again, straight from the CDC. So you don't have to say, well, I heard it one way from one instructor and another way from another instructor. This is straight from the CDC website. And it specifically says that handpieces and other intraoral devices that can be removed from air and water lines of dental units should be cleaned and heat sterilized between patients. And that includes high-speed, low-speed, electric, endo, and surgical handpieces, as well as handpiece motors and attachments, unless the manufacturer's IFU specifically says you can't. Now, how do you tell if it can withstand heat sterilization? An easy way to tell is to look at the motor or the handpiece itself. If it has a universal symbol for sterilization, which is three squiggly lines, and a temperature, well, you know that that should be heat sterilized between patients. Water quality in instrument reprocessing is just as important in this area as it is chairside, right? So we are using tablets and liquids and straws to maintain and water filtration systems to maintain the water that's used on the patients, but I think very little consideration is given to water that's used in the sterilization area. I don't know about you, but it's annoying to lug around large containers of distilled water back and forth, right? So I like in-office water systems that make instrument reprocessing water quality. So I can rinse my instruments with a certain type of quality water. It generates distilled water from my sterilizer. It even makes water that I can use to fill my bottles for my dental units. So how is ensuring that we have good water safe? Well, filtered water provides, or these systems provide filtered water for patient treatment, for rinsing instruments, and also for our autoclave and our instrument washer, right? It's predictable in that it eliminates corrosion and scaling in instruments, in instrument washers, and in ultrasonic units. It prevents clogs and corrosions in your delivery units. It's efficient in that it eliminates time that I would have spent buying that water, and also it's efficient in that it eliminates all that extra storage space that I need to store and house these water. And it's compliant in that it eliminates staff risks created by carrying around heavy jugs of water, right? And it makes it easier to treat biofilm because of the reduced amount of scale in our delivery unit lines. So some considerations with water. Storage, so our final area, storage. Needs to be on clean shelves or designated cabinets and drawers, designated for sterile items only. I should not find, what are some things I've seen in sterilization drawers? I've seen a hairbrush once. I found peanut M&Ms once in a drawer, and I'm not talking about in its package. I'm talking about loose peanut M&Ms rolling around in the drawer, so that when I open the drawer, the peanut M&Ms would roll forward, and I would shut the drawer, and the peanut M&Ms would roll back, right? That I've seen, I've seen a fuzzy spoon very recently in one of those drawers too. What had happened, I surmise, nobody wanted to fess up to it, but I think somebody was a yogurt fan and eating in the operatory, and somebody must have walked by and they shoved that spoon in the drawer and forgot about it. And next thing you know, open this drawer that's designed to house sterile packages, and here's a spoon growing mold spores, right? So common question I get is, how long can I store these instruments before I have to reprocess them? Well, you can store them indefinitely because it's event related, right? As long as the integrity of the packaging is in place, you do not have to reprocess those, unless the manufacturer lists an expiration date. So you do want to check the manufacturer's expiration date for the package. It's not uncommon for you guys to grab those and then put it in like a nice container store container, right? And you've tossed the box and you don't know the expiration date for that particular lot number of instrument pouches that you're using. Don't store those items unpackaged. Remember, if you're sterilizing it unpackaged, well, then how are you going to store those items? They really should be sterilized and then stored in its original packaging. Here are some common breaches I've seen in this area. Wet packets, right? In the top picture in the middle there. On the right, we have some folding technique problems where we have a gap large enough that we can, I could stick a pen in that gap, right? I have actually found dead ladybugs inside sterilization pouches that have crawled into there and then just never made their way out of it. And on this bottom picture, we have the folding technique on the right, and on the left, we have an instrument poking out of the package. So now that we know the 4 areas, receiving, cleaning, and decontamination, preparation and packaging, sterilization, and storage, when you write your operating procedure, you need to approach it with answering these 4 questions. How do we ensure safety? How do we ensure predictability? How is it efficient, right? How is it going to save time and labor? How is it going to ensure compliance, again, with state and federal recommendations and standards? There's a ton of information. I mean, a ton of information that's available to you when it comes to your Steri-Center. That's the great news. The bad news is there's a ton of information out there for you, right? So I kind of boiled down some of the things that I think have been very beneficial to the offices that I work with. Under OSHA, and you can go to osha.gov, making sure that you have a copy of the bloodborne pathogen standard available. Another reason why you want to have that available, number one, your employees have to, by law, have to have access to it, right? And number two, if there's ever an exposure incident in the workplace, a copy of that bloodborne pathogen standard needs to go with them as part of the post-exposure protocol. Having the hazard communication standard, a copy of that available too, and the PPE standard as well. Knowing what the state dental board for your state requires when it comes to infection control and safety as well, including safety and infection control with instrument reprocessing. If you want to know whether or not your disinfectant is EPA registered, here's the link that you can utilize, and you can look up your specific product. I mentioned earlier, I think that I'm working with a state dental board where they contacted me because one of their dentists is using a Sam's Club brand disinfectant, and the dentist attorney is arguing against the fact that we are required to use disinfectant that meets the specific requirements. It's EPA registered, for example, and that's hospital grade and tuberculocidal. The Food and Drug Administration, so the FDA, here, if you want to know if your equipment or diamond-coated burrs have FDA 510K clearance, this is a searchable database that you can use. I love Amy's ST79 of the resources here. That's the only one that really you have to pay for, and it's not inexpensive, but it's a fabulous resource. And I've learned so much from this document. Your local dental reps and dental manufacturers also are wonderful resources too. And again, I didn't include in the slide, but the Organization for Safety, Asepsis, and Prevention, OSAP.org, also has fabulous resources. I'm so excited about the number of resources that I can share with you. The other one, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, well, there's no fewer than, 3 that's available. And the first one, Guidelines for Infection Control in Dental Healthcare Settings, 2003. The Summary of Infection Prevention Practices in Dental Settings, Basic Expectations for Safe Care. Basic, as in the bare minimum, folks, right? I love this document because it's divided into 2 sections. The first half questions your practice on whether or not you have the proper policies and practices in place. The second half of this checklist that's in this document asks you, are we doing what we say we're doing? So it's kind of where the rubber meets the road, right? You're going to need to set aside some time to observe. You're going to watch patients flow in and out of your treatment rooms. You're going to watch instruments flow in and out of sterilization. You're going to ask a series of questions. And if you're not the dentist or the practice owner, you can actually share this information with the business owner so that they know what's going on as far as compliance with infection control. If you're tech savvy, there's also an app for that, right? I love that. There's an app for everything. And the CDC Dental Check app is available for Android. And if you're an iPhone user, you can download this app. That is not a typo. It's actually called Dental Check, all one word, a Dental Check app. And then we have the 2008 Guidelines for Sterilization and Disinfection in Healthcare Settings. Can you tell I'm super excited about all the stuff that's available to you? There's a series from our friends at SciCan that addresses Spec and does a deeper dive on each of these, right? There's an article on safety. How do we ensure safe instruments? Safety in instrument reprocessing. It covers predictable outcomes. It covers efficiency, and compliance is coming very, very soon. So keep your eyes peeled for that one. There's an ebook called Get Excited about your Steri-Center, and I called it a Get Excited About Your Steri-Center because I'm passionate about this area. Your Steri-Center, to me, is kind of like the heart of your practice. And you think in a functional perspective, if you think about it, the moment that dirty instruments stop flowing into your Steri-Center, you have a bottleneck, right? And that's a pain point for your team members, and it's not efficient, and clean instruments aren't flowing out. Well, it's kind of like having a mini heart attack, right? Your heart, it's not functioning the way it should be. It's not functioning optimally. Okay. I always like to end my presentations, and we're near the end. Can you believe? Oh my gosh, we've gone through 55 minutes already. Like I said, I could talk all day about this. I always like to remind us that sometimes it's easy to overlook some of the non-compliant or unsafe practices in the Steri-Center, right? It's not always going to be obvious. It's not going to be obvious like these safety violations that I'm going to share with you, right? Over time, I think sometimes unsafe practices become part of the scenery, right? This picture, actually, I'm not going to lie, my husband has done something like this before, where he has stacked a ladder on top of other items, which is a shame knowing what I do for a living. So yeah, he gets an earful from me about that one. This one is a PPE violation, right? If I saw a bunch of people standing around in hazmat suits, I probably wouldn't want to stick around in my khaki shorts, right? And then finally, I love this one. A for creativity, but certainly an F for safety. I guess it doesn't surprise me at all that there is alcohol involved. When I asked my audiences what was a common denominator in all of these slides, the answer I always get is that they're all men. That wasn't what I was going for. I was going for, these are obvious breaches in safety. But I couldn't find any slides with women. I'm going to be honest with you. The only unsafe practices I could find online had to do with men. So no offense to the men that are listening in today. I so appreciate your time and attention. And I invite you, if you want to get some more safety tips, I invite you to follow the OSHA lady on any of my social media accounts. I would love to connect with you. And at this time, I'm going to open up the Q&A box for questions, anything, and comments. I would love to hear what you thought about this presentation, and I'm going to answer some of the questions that you all have. So let's go through this. And I so appreciate you waiting till the very end. Thank you all so very, very much. All right. So Morgan asks, what's the reasoning behind letting the dry cycle complete? Oh, Morgan, that's a fabulous question. I'm so sorry I didn't cover that. I intended to discuss that. So if you think about the fabric on a peel view patch, the paper side specifically, right? The fibers of the paper, and also on your blue CSR wrap, right? When it's exposed to steam, those fibers relax, and it allows the steam to penetrate through to make contact with the instruments on the inside. Then when it goes through the complete dry cycle, those fibers contract, sealing in those sterile instruments. When you handle a packet that's still wet, well, that wet paper side or wet pouch is now acting as a wick, right? And think of it as a sponge. It's absorbing or drawing in any of the microbes that it might come in contact with that's airborne or on the surfaces. So that's the reason why we want to handle dry packets. I hope that answers your question. Missy asks, why no in-house wipes? That's a great question, Missy. That's actually a common question that I get, and it's because if you're acting on a gauze, a 4x4 gauze, if you think about it, that 4x4 gauze is not sterile, right? In many cases, and so that disinfectant is constantly acting on that gauze to disinfect it, and therefore it reduces the efficacy of the disinfectant when it comes time for you to use it. The other reason why we don't use in-house wipes is because some chemicals, remember, disinfectants there are different chemical properties or makeup of disinfectants. It could be alcohol-based, hydrogen peroxide-based, it could be an iodophore or phenolic, and some of those chemicals actually bind with the fibers and of the gauze itself. So manufacturers are saying no in-house wipes. The science, the literature that I've read don't support the use of the creation of in-house wipes too. Abby Lynn asked me, is it the responsibility of the employer to cover all expenses accrued from an exposure incident? That's a good question, Abby Lynn. When I shared that story about the team member who reached into the sharps container, invariably I get a question that says, oh my gosh, does the employer have to cover stupidity, right? And the bottom line is yes. When we consider what the Occupational Safety and Health Administration says, it's the employer's responsibility to ensure a safe work environment and everything that entails. And that includes training around preventing exposure incidences. So they would pay the expenses, they would offer to pay the expenses for the source as well. We want to test the source as much as possible. We want to convince that source individual to get tested, because when we send our employees, if you think about it, initially all we're doing is we're establishing a baseline, and they're going to have to go in for follow-up testing to determine if they've been exposed to anything. Well, if we can get the patient to go get tested and that patient is negative, then the provider, the nurse practitioner or the MD that's doing the evaluation, if that patient is negative for everything, they may determine that no follow-up consultation or evaluation is required. But that follow-up must be offered, the testing and follow-up must be offered to the employee after any exposure instance. I hope that answers your question, Abby Lynn. Monica asked me, can a pen be used to label pouches? So if you were to label a pouch with the pen, definitely not before it goes in the sterilizer and not on the paper side, right? So best practices would be label the plastic side, and also to label, if you're using a wrap cassette, if you were to mark it, you want to mark it directly on the autoclave tape that's on the outside of that blue CSR wrap. And if you're going to label it before it goes in the sterilizer, there's a couple of options that we can use. We can use a load label gun. It's kind of like an old-fashioned price tag gun that you can dial the date, you can dial the sterilizer, that you can dial the what load you're on, and then you would just go through and just go boop, 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 and label all your packages before they go in the sterilizer. Or you can use that sterilization marker or sterilization pen I showed you earlier. It's designed specifically for labeling those packages, and those are on-label uses of those items, and the manufacturers of those pouches and wraps will also tell you that you want to use an approved labeling system as well. JJ18 asked me about a specific disinfectant that they heard the new formulation destroys materials like plastics. My personal opinion is there's pros and cons for all different types of disinfectants. It has been my experience that certain disinfectants can indeed cause plastics to crack. But again, it's about finding the right product for your practice. I have found offices that use particular brand of disinfectant that have no problems whatsoever. So do the research. Find the disinfectant that's a good fit for your office. There's a variety of formulas. You know, we now have hydrogen peroxide-based disinfectants that I know that are really popular from what I hear, because it avoids exactly what you're talking about, JJ18. Dr. Mark, let's see here. Why don't I show a picture of the dental episode of women wearing jewelry during procedures, then looking for them in biohazard? Okay. Oh, okay. So Dr. Mark, the point I was trying to make, obviously, I didn't capture the woman digging through the sharps container, but the picture that I showed at the very end was kind of is an exaggerated point that obviously breaches are not always going to be that obvious, right? You can look at that picture of the guys in the pool with the electrical cord and know immediately in your gut it tells you that's not safe behavior. But sometimes it's more subtle. And I wish I had more time to do a deeper dive on all these concepts. But this is really kind of a 30,000-foot overview, and I hope that you walked away with this with some new information that you can add to your operating procedures as it relates to your Steri-Center. And with that, we are out of time, and I want to be respectful of your time. I so appreciate you joining us tonight. And with that, have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.